We're being mic'd today for the video, and so I might go like this. You ask questions. It's going to be tough because we had a fairly interactive group yesterday. There was a lot of cross discussion, and actually we encourage that because we think strategic planning is a good way to trade information and learn. There's no set way, as Meghan will tell you. But obviously you're in strategic planning. My name is Engel. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst for the Crime and Justice Institute. This is Meghan Guevara, my colleague, also at Crime and Justice Institute. She's Managing Associate and our Technical Assistance and Strategic Planning Expert. We are doing, Crime and Justice Institute is out of Boston, but we have different bases all over the country, and we're doing a lot of technical assistance at specific sites. And the opportunity to present here was a great opportunity given the potential of the Second Chance Act grantees, especially this first group. You guys heard those very stern warnings yesterday morning, starting with Senator Brownback. Hopefully you were able to get some sleep last night with the job that you have ahead of you. But as you'll hear that from Meghan today, the strategic planning is a crucial early first step. There's a lot of opportunities to build consensus, develop a plan that can respond to the various issues that are no doubt that you're going to face over the next several months as you pull this project together and continue it. I want to welcome you and thank you guys for taking the opportunity to come here today, and also accepting the high charge that is placed on you when you proposed your project for this grant. So welcome, thanks, and as Meghan will tell you, we take a lot of questions early. PowerPoint it's easy to adjust our program, so questions and discussion is very much encouraged.
Thank you, Len. Good morning, everyone. How are you doing today? That's good. Did everybody have a nice night in DC last night? Take advantage of the fun time of being at conferences? So as Len mentioned, we're here to talk about strategic planning this morning, and that will be in the context of your grant, which you're all here to talk about, but hopefully also a larger discussion as well. Strategic planning is something that can be useful to you either as an individual agency or as a cross-agency collaborative for planning this work, but also thinking in a broader sense about what do you want to accomplish? What is the mission that you're trying to achieve individually or collectively in your community, and how can you use this plan to help map that out for the next several years? And hopefully that will help to inform your work on this grant, but also potentially other grants or other funding sources in the future, help you to leverage other resources that are available to you in the community or available to you through your legislatures or through your local counties. And I'd like to think of this as a broader tool that's available to you. And the process we're going to talk about today is relevant to this grant, but also relevant to any strategic plan that you're going to be putting together. So hopefully it's something that you can take back to your organizations to use in this context as well as in others. Before we get started, I just wanted to check in. How many of you have a strategic plan that's already in the works? Somewhat. It's getting there a little bit. And how many of you will be starting fresh after this, unless I scare you away? Okay. So we've got a bit of a mix out there. And how many of you will be making that plan collaboratively across several agencies or with a collaborative group? Okay, and how many will be doing it internally within your own agency? Okay, so good mix there as well. And after the ill-fated snowed out conference a few months ago, Len and I put together an audio slide presentation that was on the website about strategic planning. Did anybody watch that? Oh, good, because it'll be much more interesting today in person than it was when I was sitting there pressing the record button on PowerPoint. So as Len mentioned, you do have a slide set here, but we're much more interested in making this an opportunity to talk to you than we are with making sure that we get through all of our slides today. So those are there for your reference, and they are also up on the website if you're looking for them. So feel free to access those at any point. We will try to get through them today, but if we don't, it's not a big deal. And the second resource you have in front of you is a chapter from a forthcoming CGI publication that was an implementation manual on evidence-based practices. And that was the chapter on strategic planning. So a lot of what we're talking about will be referenced in that as well. That's available through our CJI website, and we had some folks yesterday that asked if we could get it up on the Resource Center website as well. It hasn't officially been published by NIC, but as soon as it is, we'll make sure that it gets up on the website. You guys all got advanced copies today. Oh, and the other question I didn't ask was how many folks are mentoring grants? Okay, so almost everybody in demonstration grants? A couple, okay, great. So feel free to interrupt me, ask questions as we go through, and also if you have feedback for any of your colleagues' questions from your own lessons learned in your jurisdictions, please feel free to answer folks as well so that we can keep this as interactive as possible. And Len and I will do Phil Donahue as best we can walking around. You already know who we are. We've talked a little bit about reasons for strategic planning. This is a chance to really sit down early in your process, and instead of diving into your work right away and figuring things out as you go, to really ask the questions, what are we trying to accomplish here? Is everybody in this room on the same page about what the end goal of this work is and how we're going to get there? What are the steps that we want to take to start moving in that direction? Thinking about what is this going to look like in a few years, and really being able to establish a vision for the work that you're going to do. There'll probably be some folks around your table that already have a good sense of that vision. They say, we know what we want to achieve. Maybe they were part of putting your grant together and they have a sense of what you envisioned. But there'll also be a lot of other folks that say, okay, we know that there's some sort of money involved. We know there's a grant. We know we have to be here, but don't really have a sense of what you're trying to achieve. And having that conversation in the early part of the process is important. And most importantly, how does this project relate to those around us? I'm sure that this is not the only grant that you all have, and I'm sure that it is not the only funding source that has requirements for you and is asking you to achieve certain things. And it's a very complicated matter to figure out how do we put all those pieces together and make sure that we're meeting all the requirements of all these different funders, while at the same time doing the daily business of our organization and trying to achieve our mission. So using strategic planning is an opportunity to say, how do we bring all that together? How do we make sure that we integrate all these different goals and make sure that we're moving in the right direction? It can also help you as you're evaluating future funding opportunities, saying, this plan tells us what we want to achieve. Is this funding source going to help us do that, or is it just going to add extraneous things on top of this where we're adding work without helping us to achieve the mission of our organization? Though these days it is hard to turn down funding if it's out there. The strategic plan helps to provide you with direction, and it links your role in the organization with the steps that, or in the community with the steps it's going to take to achieve that particular goal. It says this is what we're here for, and this is how we're achieving either the purpose of our collaborative group or the mission of our organization. It's also an excellent communication tool. You'll notice in the chapter from the implementation manual that I like to use a matrix strategic planning format that's just a short couple of page document, because that lets you share with the whole world, your funding sources, your policy makers, other agencies, this is what we do, this is what we're here for, this is what we're trying to accomplish. And it is able to share that in a quick, easy to read format that lets everybody else know what you're all about, rather than saying, here's the 20 pages of our strategic planning document and knowing that it will end up on somebody's shelf somewhere. We're going to talk about a, I think, 9-step process today. And we will be going over this kind of at the high-level view to start out with, and then we can start diving into questions as we go. First step, deciding on a planning structure, thinking about who's going to be involved in this, what approach are you going to take to doing this work. Picking your planning team, who needs to be at the table for this part of the process, who are the key stakeholders, who are the folks that if you don't involve, then they're going to be making your lives miserable for the next 5 years as you're implementing the strategic plan. How do you deal with the fact that you have 100 people that would like to be at the table, but you only have chairs for 20 of them? What are some other ways to get people involved? Providing background information. How many data geeks do we have in the room? Data geeks? Not many data geeks in the crowd. Okay. So this is the step where you bring in your data geeks, and this is when you're starting to say how much information can we gather to inform the process, and it's a mix of that quantitative numbers that you can get and also the qualitative perspectives from all of your partners. And then developing vision and mission statements or purpose statements or whatever you want to call them. This is a very important step and also usually your first major stumbling block in your process, especially for those of you who are working with collaboratives, of saying, all right, we're all sitting at this table. We're probably all sitting at this table for very different reasons. We need to get to the point where we can agree on what is the purpose of our work. What are we trying to achieve here? And usually there's some disagreements there. Sometimes you lose some of your partners at that phase of the work where they say, the other 19 people at the table say, this is what we're trying to achieve, I can't get behind that. But having this conversation early can help prevent butting heads happening for years to come because you have that purpose statement or mission statement to return to when you're considering some of the steps you're going to take or you're considering some of your decisions. And is this group about reducing recidivism? Is this group about making sure that offenders are gainfully employed and productive members of the community? Is this about ensuring that victims are satisfied with the process when offenders are returning to the community? When you have that mission statement, you're able to go back and say, how is this decision, how is this action going to help to contribute to this mission or purpose of our group, and how is it not? Then the next step is conducting your environmental scan and gap analysis, which is basically looking around and saying, okay, we have all this information in front of us now, we know what our purpose is, where are we now, where do we want to be, and what are the steps that we might need to take to get from point A to point B. Those steps are going to be your strategic goals. That will be your next step of figuring out, okay, what are the steps that we need to take to be able to get from where we are to where we want to be. And then you start drilling it down a little bit and getting into what are the objectives. So those are the steps that it takes to achieve each of those goals. Finally, you're documenting and disseminating. This is a step that very often gets forgotten, where you've made most of the decisions, but they're not written down in a concrete way into a complete plan. And they're not shared. It's something that is in your office and you're very proud of it because it turned out very pretty, but a lot of folks in your community or a lot of your partners don't know what the plan is. So this is when you are taking it on the road, you are handing it to your partners, you're making presentations to your county council or to your legislature about the plan that you've developed, and making sure that everybody knows what hard work you've put into it and knows what you're committing to accomplish. And then the last step, actually going to work and implementing the plan. Because another thing that happens with strategic plans is they get put into a binder and up on a shelf, and then business as usual continues. And that plan is not looked at again until it's 2 years later and you have another grant that says you need to write a strategic plan, and you dust that one off and you start over again. So how can you make sure that you're actually using that plan to guide your work and using it to hold people accountable for the things that they said that they would accomplish at the beginning of the process? And then you're done. That sounds very easy, right? No problem. So that's the overview of what we're going to be getting into today. So please feel free to stop me. For those of you who have gotten into this process and hit some of these stumbling blocks, let's talk about them. But I wanted to start out with what I think are my major lessons learned from doing this in a lot of different places around the country. And the first is to really carefully think about who is your convener, who is the person that is bringing people to the table, and who is your facilitator, who is the person who's guiding you through the process. So sometimes it will be one of you who's the convener. Sometimes you may be approaching somebody else in your community saying, all you have to do is sign the letters, because I know that if you're the person who signs the letters, and if you're there at that first meeting to welcome everyone, that people will come to the table, and you'll be able to get them there. So this is really a marketing effort to get those folks around there in the first place. And then the second step is your facilitator. And this person may or may not be the same person as your convener. And this is the person that really has the skills to keep the conversation moving, to create a sense of urgency, to deal with that one person at the table that's being problematic, or the one person that everybody's saying, oh my gosh, I wish they would just stop talking. Because we always have those folks in our groups. And so sometimes it's helpful to have a professional outside facilitator that your group hires to bring in to keep the process moving. And sometimes you will have somebody in your group or in one of your organizations that is very skilled in that area and can serve that role. But I do encourage you to not underestimate the importance of that person. And the person who's the chair of the committee does not necessarily need to facilitate the meetings. You can still have someone else who's named as your chair that you consider appropriate for one reason or another. But it's very easy for this process to get very bogged down and for your group to be unable to make decisions if you don't have somebody who's very skilled to help you with facilitation. And sometimes local universities have folks that will do that for nonprofit groups. It doesn't necessarily have to be an expensive prospect for you. And you also can make the decision about whether you want a neutral outside facilitator, someone who may or may not know your work very well but doesn't have a stake in the game, versus somebody from within one of your organizations that does have a good sense of the work but also has a bias and an opinion in the work that you're doing and is going to want to be part of the conversation. There's not necessarily one that's right or wrong. It just depends on what you think is the better fit. Communicate, engage, and communicate some more. That I've never worked with any group that has said, yes, Meghan, we have enough communication in our process. It just never happens. So making sure that even though the folks at the table know what's going on, that there's also a plan for how are you letting the community know? How are you letting the people within your own organizations know? How are they bringing the message back? Are you putting together one-page summaries after all of your meetings so that it can go back to the governor and to the General Assembly so that you're keeping people posted on your progress? And I imagine that this job is going to fall to a lot of you in this room to make sure that, that communication is happening. You're living, eating, breathing this every day. So to you, it probably feels like you're talking about this too much and that people are tired of you and feel like you're a broken record. But most likely they're feeling like, that's a closed door. We don't know what's going on in that room. And you need to be constantly talking to people. For the folks that refuse to come to your table, the departments that say, no, we're not interested in this, or why do we care about those folks that are coming back to the community? That's not our problem. We've got other people to serve. Making sure that you're still keeping them engaged and keeping them informed so that you're saying, even if you don't want to be there, we still want you to be here. We still want you to know what's happening. Creating a sense of urgency. It's very easy for strategic planning to drag on and on and on if people don't feel like there's any reason that they need to finish. So it's very easy to say, well, we can't agree on the mission statement this month, let's table it till next month. Or it's June, a lot of people go on vacation, July and August, let's just wait and we'll come back to it in September. And I'm sure we've all been on committees where those things have happened. So think about where you can get a sense of urgency, and if you can't come up with one off the top of your head, see if you can make one up. And I mean that in all seriousness. Do you want to try to have this done before the legislature meets in the fall so that you can present your plan to the legislature? Can you work with your grant monitor through Second Chance to say, can you give us a deadline for this when you expect it so that we have something to go back to our group with? Because it's always much easier for us to make decisions when we have a deadline that we need to achieve versus knowing that if it waits till next month, nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to explode just because we don't have our strategic plan. Working within the confines of a grant is helpful there because you can say, well, if it takes us 18 months to get the strategic plan done, we're not going to have much time to actually go and implement and use these funds. Don't stop until you have deadlines and accountability. A lot of times it's very easy to get a group to agree on goals, but then when we say, okay, who's going to take responsibility for leading up this committee and who's going to be accountable for making sure this goal happens, suddenly everybody's kind of looking away and nobody wants to make eye contact with you anymore. And sometimes you need to, as I say, write an engraved invitation for somebody to be the person to accomplish that goal. But if there's no accountability set up, where there's not one person where we can say, all right, Len is responsible for making sure that we have an employment plan. He's going to convene the committee, and when we get together again in 3 months, it's going to be Len's responsibility to report out and say, this is what our plan is. Then Len knows that I'm going to be looking at him in 3 months. He knows I'm going to be calling him once a month between now and then and saying, hey, Len, how's that going? And that he's the person that is going to be embarrassed if it's not finished, and also the person that's going to get the pats on the back when we have a good plan. And you also need deadlines, because we all have a lot to do, and things that don't have deadlines fall at the bottom of our list. It's just human nature. You all have a lot of things with deadlines on your desk. So making sure that there are deadlines that are reasonable, but that let people know that there's going to be an expectation. And balance ambition and realism. If we let things go too much to the realistic side, we probably won't get a lot done because everybody has more than full-time jobs on their plate already. And if we're too ambitious, we're also not going to get anything done because we're going to set ourselves up for failure by saying we can do more than we can do. So when I work with a group on strategic plans, I try to say, what is a balance of some goals that you're really confident you can achieve, that you're already on the way to, and then what are some goals that if you could do something really wonderful with this that you would want to accomplish. And Jim Collins calls them BHAGs, the big, hairy, audacious goals. So what are your BHAGs? What are the few things that if you could really put all the work and all the effort that you wanted to into this grant, what would you get out of it? Some of those things you may have already laid out in your application, and you may be working towards them already, and those should be part of your strategic plan. But your strategic plan may also have some other goals that your group is saying, we just want to work towards this, whether we promised BGA we would do it or not. So now we'll launch into a little bit more detail around those steps. Putting together your planning structure. So the first thing to think about is, how are we going to make this work? What is the overall master plan for creating this strategic plan? So thinking about, what is the timeline and the schedule? How often do you want to bring your group together? And what is your deadline for completing the plan? I like to bring groups together about every 2 weeks while we're doing strategic planning, because it's usually enough of a timeline that we can get some work done in between, but it lets us complete a plan in a few months. Sometimes that's not possible, like if you're working with an existing group that's used to meeting monthly or something like that. But every couple of weeks for 6 to 8 weeks is usually, I find, a helpful timeline. Thinking about who that leader is going to be of the planning process, like we've talked about. What work needs to be done and what content expertise is needed. How many of you are doing your strategic plan with groups that already know reentry very well? Oh, good. So that's always helpful when you have a group that has the content expertise coming in and can dive into the planning. Some of the rest of you may be working with groups that really do not have a sense of these issues and need a lot of upfront education. You need some time to have conversations about, what are we talking about? What does reentry mean? What are the issues that are coming up with our clients? Or that need education about, what do the other agencies around the table do? And Len and I were talking about this yesterday, where we've never walked into a system where a system mapping exercise of some sort hasn't been helpful. And even folks that have been working together for 20 or 30 years, when they actually have the opportunity to sit down in a formal way and say, what is it that you do? How do you work with people when they walk through the front door of your agency? Usually everybody learns something that they didn't know about the way their system functions. So that can be helpful early on, and it can also help to build respect for the other agencies at the table and better understanding of the hard work that everyone does. So you want to make sure that your group is on the same page and up to speed on everything when they get started, and usually you don't want to make assumptions about that, because nobody ever raises their hands and admits that, yes, I've been working with Joe for 15 years, but I have no idea what it is that Joe does every day. It's going to be up to you to say, well, we're doing this process as part of our strategic planning, and everybody can keep it to themselves when they learn something new. Will we need working groups or subcommittees? As I'll mention on the next slide, I usually find that 15 to 25 people is a good size for a strategic planning team, but it's really up to you what you consider to be the right size for that group of people that you can get some work done. If you have more people to involve than that, then usually a working group or a subcommittee structure is a good way to do that, and say, okay, we'll have 15 people at the table, but we'll develop 5 working groups on different areas, and then we can bring in some more frontline employees from our agency. We can bring in some more partners from different agencies and make sure that there's more opportunities for people to get involved. Another option is using an advisory group structure. If you have a lot of folks that maybe at a higher policy level and will want to have a say in the process and want to have some input, but they're not the folks that are really going to be rolling up their sleeves and getting their hands dirty of putting the plan together. Having a couple of meetings through your process where people can have some input and give some feedback on your work, but have those not actually being your working meetings, can be another way to get people involved. So having advisory groups or focus groups or educational opportunities for the frontline staff in your organizations and in other organizations, where you're not just talking about the process but also listening to people's concerns and getting their feedback about what they have to say, can be very helpful in these early planning stages as well. This is also where your neutral facilitator can be helpful, because sometimes having those groups run by management is helpful, because people feel like my manager is here and they're listening to what I have to say. In other organizations, I find it helpful to have an outsider who's running those focus groups, so people feel like they can be candid and speak their mind without feeling like their supervisor's in the room listening to what they have to say. And those focus groups and the concerns that come up can help inform your environmental scan later, when you're asking yourself, what are some of the hurdles that we need to overcome? And also, what are some of the strengths that are there in our departments that maybe we hadn't thought about? Because there may be a lot of good ideas coming from your front line that you hadn't considered in this process. And you won't be able to have all of your 100, 200,000 employees at the table for strategic planning. This will give them an opportunity to have a voice in that. And finally, how will decisions be made? And do any of you work on committees right now where there's a formal decision-making process in place, be it consensus or majority vote, or consensus with a voting backup? Yeah. This is a step that some committees sometimes skip, of thinking about how are we going to make decisions. And then every time a decision comes up, you have to think about it again, how are we going to make decisions. So deciding in advance of what is, in general, the one decision-making model that our group is going to be using can be helpful so that you always have a fallback. Consensus is nice, but it can be very difficult to get a group to consensus on every issue. So being able to say, maybe consensus is our first choice, but then we have a backup of a majority vote, or maybe there is an executive team or executives from multiple agencies that are making the final call on a lot of this, so your committee is making recommendations that go to that executive team. Think about that in advance, what you think is a logical decision-making model for your group that you can propose when the group gets together. There's a quote I like from General MacArthur that says, "Plans are useless, but planning is indispensable." And that is the case with a lot of strategic plans because they do change over time, circumstances change, but taking the time with these early planning steps and making these decisions up front can save you a lot of hassle later on when you do need to make those changes. And it's usually a few hours of your time in the first place that saves a lot of hours later on. And the other issue that didn't come up there was union representation, which is frequently an issue in different communities if people are going to be asked to do their jobs in different ways, or there's going to be different responsibilities that come along with your efforts. Trying to bring the unions to the table as early as possible in the process can not necessarily mean that it's not going to end up being an adversarial issue or it's not going to end up coming up in collective bargaining. But if you have somebody who's a union rep who's able to be part of all of your conversations, that's hearing the logic of your decisions, that's able to have input into the strategic planning process, that person can end up being an ally when changes do come down the pike that could affect your contracts with your correctional officers or other folks that are represented by a trade union. And I also like to mention the folks in your organizations who are the informal leaders, that even though they're not managers and don't have any official title, you know that they're the person that everybody goes to for information. They're the person that everybody looks to when they're trying to figure out what should I do about this and what direction should I be taking. And those are great people to have around the table because you know that once they know what's going on, everybody in the organization will know what's going on, and that they have a good pulse on what are some of the issues that people are concerned about and that their colleagues might bring up. In terms of size, it's really up to you as to what you think is an appropriate size for your group. You want it to be large enough that you've got diversity in the room and that you're not leaving out any important constituency groups, but small enough that you can actually get some work done and that you're not sitting around a table that stretches 50 feet to the back of the room. And you also want to get a variety of perspectives. It's very easy to invite the folks to the table that are very on board with this and are cheerleaders for your effort, and then the work of that group can be stymied when you bring it back to the broader community because it's a little bit too Pollyanna. So having the folks that are pushing back, that do make your meetings more difficult and do make your decisions more slow, but if you're able to get to the point where you can reach consensus with those folks, it makes your plan much more realistic. And when you're bringing it back to constituents, a lot of times people are able to say, well, if Len's on board with that, you know, he's got a good tough on crime reputation, and if he thinks that this is okay, then it's probably gonna work. So that can create a little bit more tension up front, but it can be good productive tension within your group.
People at the front line are less likely to feel that they're really involved, and so getting them to be interested in participating in this can be very difficult because they often feel like, okay, the administration or the supervisors are basically inviting us in to do something that they've already decided on doing. And this is sort of just window dressing. And part of the strategic plan, as Meghan explained yesterday, is to try to make them feel that they're really involved in the process, that it's important to have them, their interaction, because they're really going to have a role in the final decision making. And that can be difficult because there's a cultural disconnect sometimes in agencies and you know, sometimes in the communities where certain groups do not feel that they've been engaged, and they see this as, well, you know, they're just asking me to come along, you know, to get my presence, but not really to get me to be interactive. I'm not going to make a difference here. So changing the culture is an important step to getting these folks to buy into this and to participate.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion, that there is some frustration sometimes of, why do we need to figure this out ourselves when we know that somebody else has done it, and why do we need to reinvent the wheel? And that's what a lot of my work is coming in as the consultant. I have some people say, well, you're the expert and we're paying you, so why don't you just tell us what to do? And which is helpful to some extent of saying it makes sense if I have knowledge to share that knowledge with you and to be able to give you some options. But it doesn't make sense because at the end of the day, I get back on a plane and I go to Denver and I'm not the person that does the work that you do every day. So if you're going to decide to work with somebody external, finding a person that has a good balance of wanting to offer you support and information, but doing it in a way that builds capacity in your organization. And people may feel uncertain about their level of knowledge or their level of expertise to be able to make those decisions, but there's a lot more expertise and knowledge in the room than people give themselves credit for, usually. So for something like looking at evidence-based practices, it can be helpful to bring somebody in from the outside and say, this is what the research says. These are some different program models from around the country that may be relevant to a community of your size and of your structure and with some of the issues that you're facing. But these are the options that are available to you, and only you have a sense of what are the resources that we have, what are the things that logistically we could put in place here, what do we think our community is going to be most open to, what do we think our ex-offender returning population is going to be most amenable to, what's culturally appropriate for our community, and then you to make that decision. So to have some folks that are giving you options rather than coming in and making the decisions for you. And it is uncomfortable for people sometimes to be put in the position to have to make those decisions, and you want a facilitator of your group, whether that's you all or somebody else, that is willing to push people outside their comfort zone a little bit without pushing them too far. And ultimately, at the end of the day, people have more ownership if they make those decisions, because it's very easy for somebody to say a year down the line, well, that consultant did this, and that consultant didn't really know what it was going to be like here, and it's easier to throw the plan out the window when it's a consultant's plan than it is when you were part of making the decision, because then you've got some ownership and feel like you want to defend the plan at that point. That's a really great question. Thank you. So this background information stage is the point where it can be helpful to bring in somebody from the outside to provide some education for your group if you want to get everybody to a certain baseline level of knowledge. This is also community culture. There are some communities that feel like experts are always from the outside, and they don't want to listen to somebody from within their community, but if it's somebody from a university or somebody from Washington, D.C., they'll listen. And then there are other communities where nobody from the outside could possibly know what's going on in our community, and they really are looking for a local expert. Again, no right, no wrong. You know your communities, so figure out who's going to be the most appropriate person to provide that education. Data collection with measures. This is when you bring your data to the table. How many of you have excellent information systems where you're able to press a button and get all the data that you want? Yeah. Nobody does. And a lot of times folks say, well, we don't have any data. That's not true. You just don't have a lot of data, or you don't have data that's easily accessible. So it's okay when you're starting strategic planning to start small and say, we can't look back at the past 3 years and tell you the recidivism rates of all the folks who have gotten out of prison, but maybe we can go in and pull a month of paper files and just get a snapshot of that. We may not be able to tell you the employment rates of everybody that has gotten out of prison, but maybe each of the employment agencies at the table is willing to go through a couple months of files and see how many folks that they worked with were offenders returning to the community. So it's okay to do something that's quick and dirty to be able to get you some numbers to start with without feeling like you need to have a 150-page data report that frankly probably everybody isn't going to read anyway. And sometimes it's basic questions like, do we even know how many people are returning from prison every year? Is there an accurate count of how many people are coming back to communities? And do we know their race and ethnicity data, their ages and basic demographic profile? And you may just want to start there to say, can we get a sense of how many people we're talking about? So it's okay that you're not able to get every piece of data that you want. And probably one of your strategic goals is going to be about improving your data collection capacity and improving your ability to share information. But for this step in the process, everybody at the table making a good faith effort to say what are the 1 or 2 or 3 pieces of information that my agency can offer that I can bring to this process is going to be helpful in making sure that A, you've got some information to inform what you're doing, and B, that people are getting used to this data-driven process, that they're getting used to the fact that you want some numbers at the table to back up what you're saying and not just anecdotes about here is Len and he's returning to the community and this is his situation. That's great, but is Len representative of everybody that's coming back to the community, or is he not? Is he a case study that we can work with, or is he very different from everybody else? We need some numbers to support that. So at this point, you want some of those numbers and also some of that qualitative data. If you've done focus groups with people returning to the community, if you've done focus groups with some of your staff, bring that information into this process as well. But whenever you can, try to find some numbers to back that up. This is also when graduate students can be great. They're usually nice, cheap, or free labor. They're looking to do their master's thesis on something or to work on their PhD thesis, and a reentry partnership is a great opportunity for them to be able to do that. So see what you can tap into in terms of your local university resources to help you out with this. Have any of you gone to this vision or mission or purpose statement point in your process? You can if you feel like your current mission statement is still relevant to the work of your organization, I wouldn't feel the need to rewrite it. Sometimes this can be a good time to dust off a mission statement that may be 5 or 10 years old and say, is this still relevant to the work that we do? Does it focus on reentry in the way that we want it to? Does it reflect any shifts in philosophy of the way that we do our work? If it still holds true, then you can skip this step and say, and just kind of do a re-education on your mission. If people aren't familiar with it, use this as a chance to say, let's go back and look at why we're here, why do we get out of bed every morning, and to have that conversation across your agency. If it's not still relevant, maybe it's still too much of a correctional model, maybe it doesn't have the focus on community or on victims, maybe it doesn't have a focus on rehabilitation that you may have now, this may be the opportunity to say, do we need to revisit our mission and vision statements and update it to reflect the way that we do our work now. When you're doing this process as a group, you do not want that group to be arguing over where do we put the commas and where do we put the periods in this statement. You want to ask the group, what are the key concepts that we want to include in our mission statement? Do we want to talk about victim restoration? Do we want to talk about public safety? And get the group to agree on the concepts, and then have either yourselves or a couple people get together to do the wordsmithing and put together a couple of different versions of the statement that contain those key concepts. But the last thing you want is, well, that should be a bullet point, or that should be a sentence. You'll be there all day, or into the night and the next day. And something else that some folks like to add on to this step too is also values for your group or for your organization, which can be a very worthwhile process to go through as well if you want to take the time for that. You don't necessarily need to do them both at the same time. You could do one and then come back to the other one. But that is also useful in terms of guiding your work. What are the core values that embody what we're trying to do? And now that you have that mission statement that's really guiding where you're going, you'll be doing your environmental scan and your gap analysis. Is this a step that anyone has done in any previous planning processes? There are a lot of different names for it depending on which book you're reading. There's not necessarily one that's right or wrong. You can just go with what you're most comfortable with. But it's basically saying, where are we now and where do we want to be? And what do we need to do to get from point A to point B? Tool that I like to use is a SWOT analysis, your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And basically a matrix, strengths and weaknesses speak to inside your organization or inside your group of what are the conditions or resources or capacity that are going to either assist you or that are going to serve as roadblocks for you. And opportunities and threats are external resources or conditions. They may be things you have control over. They may be things that you don't have control over. So these are things like your economic conditions, your budget environment, legislation that's just passed, anything that is going to impact your work that may be things that you say, yes, we'll try to change this, or maybe things that you just say, we just have to figure out how to deal with it. And this is pretty much just a brainstorming process of getting everything out there, taking all of that data that you have and being able to say that, these are how many people are returning to the community, these are the resources we have, these are the resources we don't have, this is why this is a favorable or unfavorable political climate to be making these changes. Just get it all out there on the table. This is where you can bring in those staff and stakeholder surveys again if you're getting information from the outside. If there's anything from that that can inform your SWOT analysis, add that on there. And also a good time to have your budget projections for your agency or for other agencies that can give you a sense of this is realistically what we're facing, this is the resources we have available to us, so what can we do? And from that environmental scan is when you start to condense things into strategic goals. At first, it's going to be more thinking about strategic priorities or goal areas, basically things that are very muddy, but you're saying, okay, well, we know that employment is an issue, so we know we need to talk about employment. We know that housing is an issue. We need to talk about housing. We know that victim notification is an issue. We need to talk about that. We know that in-reach into the facilities is an issue. So this is where you just start to get at what are those areas that you want to prioritize from the SWOT analysis to be able to focus on. And then you'll start to think about, okay, how do we take those very muddy, amorphous issues and start to condense them into something that's more specific that we can act on. And this is when you start basically writing a case plan for your organization or for your group and start to develop those SMART goals. SMART, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound goals. So you want, with specific, if I say this goal to anyone in this room, will it have the same meaning for everybody? Is it detailed enough that everybody will interpret that goal in the same way? Measurable, at the end of the day, is there some way that I can measure this so that when Len comes and asks me, did you accomplish that, I can say yes, and here's the proof that that goal has been accomplished. Attainable and realistic, is this something that we're actually going to be able to do given the circumstances around us? And time-bound, do we have a date to be able to accomplish this by? Sometimes you won't necessarily know the long-term date of when you're able to accomplish this because you may need to do more research and more exploration first. So, you want to make sure that you've got some interim dates in there, but you always want to make sure that there's a date attached to it so it's not just something somewhere off in the future that may never be attained. No one writes a SMART goal the first time around. It's never perfect the first time you put it out there. So expect that this is going to be an iterative process. Expect that it's going to take a few times through before you have a goal that people are really happy with and ready to get their heads around. This is also where you, as the people who are leading this process, or your facilitators, can be helpful in suggesting language or helping to craft some options for people. You don't want to always leave the wordsmithing to the group because that will take a very long time. So you could have folks break up into small groups to be focused on the different goal areas and trying to get them smart and bring that back to the larger group. Or you can take those goal areas and put out some ideas for the group to approve. But this isn't usually something where you want 15 or 25 people trying to agree on all of your SMART goals. And then you drill that down into a little bit more detail of, okay, what is it going to take to implement that strategic goal? If our goal is that by the end of fiscal year 2011, that 75% of offenders who are leaving our facilities will have secured employment within 6 weeks, what is it going to take for us to be able to achieve that goal? What steps need to happen within the facilities? What steps need to happen within the community? What structure do we need to put in place? Those are going to be your objectives. Sometimes you're going to know those objectives in the planning process. Sometimes you'll say, okay, we're going to be replicating this model that they used in this county in Ohio, and these are the steps that it takes to be able to do that, and we're all ready to go. Sometimes you may have no idea. You may say, we know there's probably models out there, but we haven't found them yet. So your first objective is going to be to research employment models in other parts of the country and to say that in 6 weeks your committee is going to come back with some recommendations of different approaches to use. And that's okay. And that's where your strategic plan becomes a living, breathing, coffee-stained document, because you reach that 6-week point, your group makes a decision about, okay, what model are we going to use, and then you add the rest of your objectives based on the model that you pick. So don't expect that you're necessarily going to have all the answers there, but you do want to make sure that there is some next date and next deadline for when you're going to make that next decision. who will do this work? A lot of times folks like to pick the person that didn't show up for that meeting and put their name into it. But you want to have somebody at the end of the day who the buck stops with them on each of these goals. And they probably have a committee that they're working with that supports them. They probably will take the effort of several people, but you want to be able to know that I'm going to be able to go back to this person and say, what is the progress on this goal, and that they're going to be able to be held accountable. And they know that everybody at the meeting is going to be turning and looking at them and saying, so Len, how's that going? And they're the ones who were responsible for explaining progress or explaining lack of progress. And finally, how will it be measured? In the handout that you have from the strategic planning chapter, there is an example of a matrix strategic plan towards the back. Oh, it's the very last page, so it makes it easy. Okay. When we were publishing the book, they told me that the page had to go this way, which is why it's kind of squished. I would much rather have it go this way. But you'll notice the last column on here says quality benchmark. And I really like to have that column built right into a strategic plan because it makes me remember that I need to have a way to measure all of my different goals. And I may not know what those measures are from day one. I may need to figure it out. I may need to get some outside help. That's one of the things that the technical assistants through the Resource Center can help you with. But I want it right on there saying this is how I'm going to measure my goals. It's important to have a measurement for each of your goals. Those measurements do not always need to be terribly complicated. Sometimes it's just a matter of being able to count the number of folks that go through a particular program and then being able to say whether they completed successfully, and that's okay. You will need to have some complicated measures, probably like reoffense rates for your overall plan, but don't feel like every measure on your plan needs to be very statistically complicated, because then you'll be driving yourself crazy with all the different things that you have to measure. So usually you're going to have a mix of some very straightforward and some very simple measurements on your plan. And this is another great place for university partners to bring folks in who have some experience with measurement, evaluation, and quality assurance to help you out, and also a good time to call the Resource Center. And I know there's some conversations about data that are going to be happening later today, which will hopefully be helpful in that respect. But probably those questions will keep coming up over the next several months. And it's never the same conversation hypothetically early in the process as it is when you actually have the goal in your hand and you're figuring out how to measure it. So please feel free to seek out some help there if you feel like you need it. Though I'm sure all of your groups have full-time data and research and evaluation staff, right? Then document and disseminate. Figure out how you're going to publish your strategic plan. So you're taking all that information from all the different grantees, condensing it, and especially when you're dealing with policymakers, that short and sweet message becomes very important of figuring out what are people looking for, what's the bottom line that they need to know, and how can we get that in a relatively short, succinct message, because those stakeholders are dealing with inundation of a ton of information every day. And we'd like to think our project is most important. Very often planning collaboratives include people who were part of a reentry process and maybe a few years down the road from that, or families of offenders that are participating, and sometimes victims as well, people who have been affected by a returning offender in the past and have a perspective there, can be great additions to your planning process. Sometimes you'll have folks on your group that are made uncomfortable by that, and it's up to you as to whether you want to fight that battle, but you may want to put together focus groups or advisory groups of people who have been returning offenders or victims groups, so that you can bring those voices into your process. Can be incredibly helpful in terms of perspectives about what works or what doesn't work in the system. We work with a lot of organizations that do client satisfaction surveys with offenders, and that's always I shouldn't say always, but 95% of the time there's a lot of resistance to that, and saying people are very nervous about what they're going to hear from the clients. And usually it's very positive feedback overall, and then some very constructive, helpful information about things like, well, I'm supposed to be at work all day, but I can only make appointments with my probation officer, my parole officer from 9 to 5, so I don't know how I can do both when I have transportation issues, so extending hours at some of your reentry centers to make things flexible around people's work schedules, or other things that folks may not have thought of, but the people who are going through this process are able to help you with. If you're able to make these small adjustments, it makes it much easier for people to be successful in the community and comply with any terms of supervision. Your strategic plan and the data behind it are also a very helpful tool when you have that inevitable situation where somebody who is going through your reentry program commits a new offense and is on the front page of the paper. And no matter how wonderful your evidence-based practices are and how perfect your reentry planning is, that's going to happen. You're not going to achieve 100% reduction in recidivism. And so a piece of this planning process should also be your approach to the media and being able to say, yes, this is a horrible situation. We're very upset that this has happened. We're going to look into whether there were any issues on our end that affected the situation and anything that we could have done better. But we also want to talk about the fact that in addition to this person, we had 3,268 folks that returned to the community last year. This many of them are employed. This many of them have been successful in the community and not reoffended. And you want to have all those numbers at your fingertips. And you want to be able to talk about your new reentry programs that have been very effective. And so if you haven't crafted a media message from this, then you're not going to be ready when that phone call comes. So work with your PR folks if you have them, or if not, work with the folks that are as close to PR folks as you have to be able to say, how can we use this strategic plan proactively? How can we put together some press releases and get out a positive message while we have the opportunity? And then how can we have this in our back pocket with some of that data we collected in step 3 so that when there is a problem that we've got some data to back up the good work that we do and to support ourselves in addition to having to respond to this terrible situation. And we're not always so good at that. We don't promote ourselves necessarily as much as we should, and a lot of times we see the good work that we do as just kind of another day at the office, but the community doesn't get that message, and they don't often understand our work, they don't understand why we do it, and we need to get more of that out there so that there's more support for it. And if possible, provide question and answer opportunities before the plan is public. Don't necessarily give people the misperception that they have the opportunity to change the plan if they don't, but it's helpful to be able to circulate a draft and have people tell you, well, this isn't clear, I don't really understand what you mean by that, or how come you didn't include this, and just have the opportunity to have a conversation with some of those stakeholders before people feel like this is a done deal and I haven't had a chance to even look at it or talk about it yet. So this PR step at the end is just as important as that initial engagement step at the beginning. And hopefully you've been communicating throughout the process and putting out email updates after your meetings to employees and to stakeholders and keeping people up to date through the whole process so that your plan isn't a surprise when it comes down at the end. And then finally, the go-to-work phase. And as the person who will be tracking the strategic plan probably in your organizations, you need to decide, is this strategic planning group going to continue to meet to be able to track the progress on the plan, or is this going to fall to an individual or an agency? How are you going to keep communicating about the progress of the plan? Some plans have a status column over on one end. That's just an opportunity to put in bulleted updates once a month or once a quarter of here's how everything is going. And how are you going to make decisions about changes to the plan? So you may have an implementation team that either is the same as your strategic planning team or a new group that comes together to help you track the team and maybe meets quarterly to get updates and make changes on it. It may just fall to you as the project manager for all of this to keep track of it, but you want to make sure that that strategic plan is on your desk all the time, that you're getting updates from folks about what's going on, whether that's making phone calls, whether that's asking people to send you reports, and you're constantly reminding people that this plan is there and that this is what we're working on. We've all probably worked in groups or agencies where a strategic plan is something you do every 3 years. It goes up on a shelf and it stays there until 3 years later when you pull it out to make the next strategic plan. So that may be the assumption of a lot of the folks in your group that, well, we did this because the BJA grant said that we had to do it, and so there it is and it's pretty and we're done. And it will only be through your efforts of keeping this plan in front of people and saying, nope, this is what we said we promised we were going to do. Let's see how we're doing on it and what can I do to help you to keep moving and to keep everything going. This is the hardest part. But this is where you make sure that those meetings weren't useless, and where people can't look back and say, I could have gotten 15 hours worth of work done while I was at all those strategic planning meetings, and we just made this strategic plan and nothing happened with it. This is where people know whether those efforts that they put in for all those hours were helpful. And this is one of the things that will help determine whether 3 years from now people will come back to the table when you're ready to update your plan and you're ready to do this again. So we have just a few more minutes. There's some contact information at the end of here. Whoops. But if you would like, there's one agency that I would like to talk about as just kind of a case study that I think is helpful, but also feel free to interrupt me because your agencies are the ones that are most important here. Is there anyone in the room from California? Okay, so you're familiar with SB 678? Okay, so we just finished doing some work with an organization in California, probation department, that we were brought in separately, but it just happened to coincide with SB 678, which is new legislation in the state of California, whose goal is to reduce revocations to prison. And for departments within the state that are able to reduce those revocations, they're able to see some financial return, but they have to be using those resources to be put towards evidence-based programs. So departments now are trying to figure out, okay, how exactly are we going to do this? There are requirements from the state for reporting and for some data collection that come with that. A couple of different state agencies that have their hand in how that's going to work. And it's also going along with a lot of larger changes in the justice system in California. So a bit of a perfect storm that is leading to some frenzy, but also some good opportunities within the state. And I went into this probation department with some funding from NIC to do their strategic plan. It's a small department, less than 100 staff. So I had the benefit of I could fit everybody into one room and talk to them all at the same time. Where are you from in California, sir? Okay, so you do not have the benefit of being able to fit all of your department into one room at the same time. No. So it's a very different picture, and this was an organization that decided, okay, we need to get our own house in order before we bring our partners in. And they wanted to keep their stakeholders educated on the process, but they said, we need to do this in-house first before we try to do a group plan. And I was contracted to come in and do some organizational assessments and 4 strategic planning meetings, which I, as a consultant coming in, which is usually what I recommend for me to be able to come in and be on site 4 times to work with a particular site. And the first meeting, we did a lot of education around what is evidence-based practices and also what is strategic planning, because a lot of folks in this department had never done strategic planning before. And we did that with everybody in the department, and that was on a Tuesday afternoon, I think. And I said, tomorrow morning we're going to have our first strategic planning meeting, and everybody's invited. And that was all we said, was that everybody's invited to come to strategic planning, please show up. So I ate breakfast the next morning, and I said, I wonder, am I going to be sitting alone in this room tomorrow morning for strategic planning? So the next day I walked in, and we had about 20 people show up, which is a good size. And about 3 of those folks were frontline staff who asked a lot of really good questions, and we just spent a few hours talking about what does this mean, what are we going to do, how is this going to work. And finally, one very brave soul raised her hand, and she said, I came here, but I didn't really think I was invited. And I said, you know, why is that? And she said, because usually this kind of stuff is just managers, and all the staff don't really believe that they could actually come to this meeting. And I noticed when she came in, she kind of stuck her head in and waited and looked around, and she was looking straight at her supervisor as she was saying all this, you know, kind of, oh gosh, am I going to get in trouble for saying that? So we had to talk a lot about, okay, how are we going to get more of your colleagues to the table? And our next step was doing a lot of organizational assessments and surveys, which is another step that I would recommend if you have the resources. Texas Christian University has a survey of organizational functioning that they have a general survey and a readiness to change survey, and also one that's specifically a criminal justice version. So if you're either a community provider or a criminal justice organization, you can just get it off their website, and all the analysis processes is free on their website as well to get some feedback on the organization. It's the Texas Christian University. And they have one survey that's called their Readiness to Change survey, and one that is their survey of organizational functioning. You get lots of great information about where your organization is in terms of resources and readiness to do something a little bit differently. I think .edu. And you should be able to Google it as well. And actually maybe, oh no, we didn't give you the assessment chapter. The link is in the assessment chapter, but you can get in touch with Len or I as well, and we'd be able to give you that information. So one of the things that we did to engage staff was do those surveys. And we did a lot of marketing before the surveys to talk about how the information was going to be used, to offer people confidentiality and anonymity through the surveys so that they knew that the information wasn't going to get back. And then before our next meeting, the chief did another all-staff meeting, gave the feedback on the surveys, and let people know, again, everybody's invited to this. We really want you to be part of the process. And the next time we had a couple more people, a couple more frontline staff show up. And that was the day that we were doing our gap analysis. And they told me, they said, got a couple more people, but people still don't really feel like they're invited. So I said, all right, what do we need to do? And they said people need a chance to talk without any of the managers in the room. So the next time around, we had focus groups that I came in and did a couple of focus groups. And again, I said, is anybody going to show up? And had packed rooms both times, where we went over the data again without the chief in the room. And people had an opportunity to ask lots of questions about it. And also about how are we going to use this information, because we collected all this data and, you know, about how people felt about their supervision, how they felt about the resources in the department, how they felt about the changes that were happening, whether they felt like they had the skills and training to do their job. Gave them a lot of feedback, and they asked a lot of questions. And then the next meeting of the strategic planning group was that afternoon. And it seemed like we kind of convinced folks that morning, because we had a few people that showed up that afternoon. So by that point, we've been kind of collecting little by little, and we ended up with a group that was about 50% management and 50% frontline staff for the organization. So by this point, this was our third meeting, and we were doing our mission statement and our strategic goals. And that group was part of putting together a revised mission statement for the department. We looked at examples from other departments around the country. We looked at their old mission statement, which hadn't been changed since, I think, 1992, so it was ready for dusting off. And came up with a really great statement that had a lot of good input from different parts of the department, and also about 10 different goal areas around evidence-based practices, and also basic things like safety in the facilities and safety in the community, and things that are perfectly okay to have in your strategic plan, even if they're not specifically related to reentry, because they're about how you do your business. But people didn't want to stop there. They said, before we finalize the mission statement, we should ask everybody. So we had two of the administrative assistants volunteer to put together a campaign to publicize the mission statement. They put a comment box out in the lobby. They attached the mission statement to everybody's paychecks before they went out the next time, and they said, we want to know what you think. And the supervisors volunteered to discuss it at all of the next unit meetings that they had. We didn't get a lot of feedback. We had about 5 people that made comments, but what we did get a lot of feedback on was people feeling happy that they had been asked, and saying that they didn't put in any comments because they thought it was fine, they liked it, but they were really glad that they'd had the opportunity to have some input into the statement. And at first, the team had been nervous about asking for feedback, because they said, what if 100 people have opinions? That didn't happen. But it was just enough that people felt like they had been included. So by the next meeting, we had feedback from the department, we had a mission statement, we had goal areas, and then we spent that next meeting talking about, okay, how do we solidify this into objectives? How do we ratify our goal area? We ratify those final goals. And had enough information then that I could work with a couple of people, representatives, including an administrative assistant, a couple managers, and a supervisor, to put all that together into a final version of the plan, because I wasn't going to have the whole group nitpick and wordsmith around everything. So the 5 of us got together, we did the nitpicking and the wordsmithing, and just brought it back to the group and got a little bit of feedback. The other piece that was important in all of that was that one person in the group was assigned each of those goal areas to help develop it, to do the background research behind it, and to bring back the information for all the meetings. So by the end of 4 meetings, and this was over 5 months, which is my fault because I got married in the middle of it and screwed everything up. We had goal areas, we had objectives, we had people that were invested in each of those goals and ready to take the lead on them. We had a group that had good chemistry, that was a cross-section of the agency, that's now committed to meeting quarterly to continue that process for however long it takes. I'll have to get back to you all. This was just a few months ago, and we'll see how it goes. but it wasn't something that took a ton of time. It was mostly something that took a lot of thought. And if you're willing to put the thought into this and say, what does it really take to get people engaged and get people on board? I'm sure there's some people in that organization that hate the strategic plan or not particularly fond of me, and I would have never been able to drag them kicking and screaming into that room ever. And that's okay. You're not going to get everybody. You're never going to get everybody. Don't even try. But if you can get enough folks that there's a critical mass and have enough people feel included, you end up with a plan that people feel bought into. So please feel free to get in touch with Len or I if you have any questions, or if there are, we've worked with a lot of organizations that we may be able to connect you with if you want a peer resource to talk to, because we have a lot of stories of wonderful, hardworking agencies that we've been very proud to be associated with. And the Reentry Resource Center is here for you for all these questions as well as you get started. So we hope that you will take advantage of that as it is available to you. And we'll be here for any questions if anybody wants to stop by. Anything else to add? All right, thank you, everyone.